Okay, ladies and gentlemen, happy Tuesday. Hopefully, everything's been going well down there since yesterday. I appreciate again your attention today as we honestly look to wrap up with Section 2. As I said to you guys yesterday, Section 2 pretty short in regards to what colonial life was like. And yesterday we took a look at the colonial family, the role of men and women in colonial society. We left off with, or I left you off with yesterday, this notion of the importance of women in colonial society as far as keeping the family together. I think it can't be understated the importance and the significant role that women played. However, the big thing was here in the colonies, it mirrored what was going on over in Europe. And the notion that women could not vote, they were not expected to take on prominent roles in society over in Europe, kind of made its way here. We will get to a point later on in the year where we will talk about the women's rights movement, but that really doesn't come about until the 19th century. And when we talk about the 19th century, we're talking specifically around the 1840s. So right now, we're talking in a time period 1650 to about 1750. It's literally not until 100 years later where people begin to finally wake up and recognize that women should start to have the same opportunities as men. Now, as far as colonial culture and society goes, I think it's important for you guys to understand that children definitely played a role during colonial times as well. While men and women were doing various jobs around the home, around the farm, children too were expected to kind of pitch in regards to that sort of help. Now, yesterday I made mention of infant fatality rates were very high in the colonies during this time because of lack of medicine, because of difficulties in childbirth. Children usually didn't survive childbirth in the early years of infancy. As I said yesterday, typically families would name their kids the little one or it, which isn't that nice of a name. Imagine having a sibling and not naming them until the age of 2. But that's how life was during colonial times. It was something that was expected, which is also another reason as to why many colonial homes averaged about 5 to 6 kids. That is not taking into account those who died during infancy. So what were children supposed to do during colonial times? Well, children were asked to be children. They were expected to eat, sleep, and play, so to speak. Whether it was playing different games like card games, marbles, jacks, or a variety of different games. Typically, life was good. However, at the age of 7, things started to change. That was where a sense of maturity was now going to be instilled in young boys and young girls. And when you think about age 7 today, we're talking typically about second graders. All right. So what would second graders be expected to do in colonial society? Well, that's when they were going to start to take on chores. Many of you may have chores as far as taking the garbage out or setting the dinner table. Maybe some of you even think about doing laundry or help doing the dishes. But regardless, during colonial times, chores or at least helping out with mom and dad went a long way for, again, a family to be self-sufficient. So what young boys were expected to do at the age of 7 was spend a few hours a day with dad learning a few things in regards to farming, in regards to going out and fish and hunting, bringing home some animals. All right. Young girls were the biggest thing at the age of 7, taking care of their siblings, childcare, helping out with the laundry, helping out with the cooking. And as the years went by, just like you guys, you would take on more and more responsibility. Something as simple as doing your own laundry, and cleaning your room. You know, when you get a little older, maybe you're helping mom or dad on the weekend vacuum and clean the living room and, tidy up to kind of lend a helping hand, so to speak. So not a lot has changed over the years, but specifically the jobs, I would think, would be a little bit different. I don't think any of your parents are asking you to go out to some of Long Island's parks to hunt squirrels for dinner. And I think we could all attest to the idea that that's a good thing, that we're not sending any of you guys out with slingshots or bows and arrows as far as getting some food goes. But nonetheless, in many times with colonial families, especially with families being self-sufficient, it would be worth it to have typically the boys, if an opportunity presented itself, to become an apprentice in a local town or city. An apprentice would be typically for boys in their early teenage years, so actually right around the time that they would have been in seventh or eighth grade. And these apprenticeships, they would be teamed up with a carpenter or a blacksmith or a cooper or a mason or some sort to learn a particular skill so that they could take that skill, learn it, and apply it to their own homes, their own farms, with their own families. And that obviously was extremely valuable when you're talking about families that were used to doing things on their own and not requiring people to come in and build certain things or have things done to the home or added on. So apprenticeships, we don't necessarily call them that today. Many a times we refer to them as internships. I'm sure some of you have older siblings, maybe who are in college and come home for the summer, and depending on what field they want to go in after they graduate college, they may take an internship. So if you want to become a lawyer, you may take an internship at a law firm over the summer. Or if you want to become an accountant, you might take, if you live around this area, take an internship in the city working for an accounting firm. If you want to become a doctor, you may take an internship in a hospital, just so that you are exposed to that particular field, and that could help you in your expertise of that particular field. So we don't necessarily call them apprenticeships today. We would probably liken it to being an internship, but certainly very useful to anyone who may want to engage themselves later on in a particular field. In the next section, or rather in section 4, we'll take a look at specifically children who were afforded the opportunity for education, were afforded the opportunity for school. As you can imagine, school is going to be very important. However, it was not necessarily available to all children, in particular females. But even more so, schooling was in many ways reserved for those who were wealthy. So we'll talk a little bit about the significance of education in colonial schools in section 4. When we talk about colonial life here in the colonies, I think one of the biggest parallels to that as far as what was going on in England was the early development of colonial social classes. In Europe, social classes had always been big as far as the idea of there being a wealthy class, a middle class, and a lower class, which would give people a certain definitive role in European societies. And that will, in some ways, quickly come here, but it was a little bit different because, keep in mind, in Europe, land was the thing that measured a person's wealth. Okay, and when we talked about last week and in the weeks before, we said that land wasn't necessarily readily available in Europe and in particular England, which is why the Americas, specifically North America, became such a popular destination for many, because people attributed to owning land with making money and being considered wealthy. But the other big reason social classes developed was because a person's prospect, was determined by birth. What is a prospect? We think about prospects in sports. Prospects are those like, a prospect in the New York Mets. They're not necessarily a professional ball player, but they have the potential to be a major league ball player. Well, prospect meant your ability to succeed is really what that breaks down to, your ability to succeed. So in Europe, a person's prospect was ultimately determined by birth. All right, you were born into a particular family. If your family had land, you were going to be considered wealthy. If your family didn't have land, your family was going to be considered poor, and it was hard to come by land because land wasn't readily available, which makes the Americas unique, and specifically the English colonies, because one could certainly come here without the idea of owning land, make enough money to purchase land, and certainly become wealthy enough. So that was another motivating factor in that people here in the English colonies weren't born into specific social classes like they would have been over in England. But as far as taking a look at the English social classes, I think it is important to understand that it did give the colonies a certain, or I should say the colonists, a certain sense of identity. If we were to break down the English colonial social classes, I think it's important to note the major classes, so to speak. And when we think about the wealthy or the upper class in colonial times, it was referred to as the gentry class. All right, so the gentry is considered to be the upper class. You see, I have here wealthy planters. When we talk about wealthy planters, we're specifically really talking about plantation owners. All right, wealthy planters, large farms, people who were merchants, traders, so those people who we said were purchasing things in port cities like Boston or New York City or Charleston, South Carolina, the people that were bringing goods over to London, bringing them to England to be sold and distributed throughout the rest of Europe. They made a tremendous amount of money. We also want to think about the significance of religion, which played a big factor during this time period. Ministers or religious priests even were considered to be upper class as well. I have here in your notes few in number, but they were the most powerful. I should also say that they were the most influential. Sorry for moving that there. They were certainly the most influential because of the degree of money that they had. I found an interesting statistic. 50 families in Virginia by 1700 owned a majority of the land in Virginia. 50 families, only 50 families. And those 50 families were plantation owners. So those were the people that, had members in, family members in the House of Burgesses. They were the ones that were playing a major part in the role of a colonial legislature and representative government. So certainly their impact in culture and in society was going to be the thing that was very much respected. Now, although the gentry class was few in numbers, the middle class became the largest class during colonial times. You see here I have the middle class is made up of small planters. Those are the families that typically owned farms that would have made a profit from their surplus. Those that didn't obviously have large farms or plantations, didn't necessarily have small gardens where they were self-sufficient, but really small planters. I guess that's an easy reference to think of in comparison to what we set up here with the wealthy. Independent farmers are the people that owned much smaller farms or really their own gardens where they provided and needed to provide only for themselves. These were the self-sufficient families in the backcountry, in the middle and southern colonies. And we would also consider the middle class to be consisting of artisans or skilled craftsmen. So this is where your carpenters, your coopers, your masons, your blacksmiths, your silversmiths, your bakers, and cooks even would fall into. These were people that would have made a decent living from their trading, from their skill sets here. And some of them owned land, some of them lived in towns and cities and didn't, but nonetheless, because of their jobs, we would consider them to be middle class. There was, by the 1700s, 1% of the middle class that considered themselves to be of African descent. That would be only 1% of the middle class. So these were people who either had immigrated from Africa, or more likely or not, would be a small percentage of the population of former slaves who were given their freedom, and in most cases would have been given land. So although they owned land, and certainly that played a big part for the colonists, Africans could not vote or hold office even if they did own land. After the middle class, we have what we would consider to be indentured servants, and this was very popular during the 1600s in regards to having people come here from Europe who were interested in coming here but couldn't necessarily afford to make their way from Europe, specifically England, Ireland, and Scotland, that they couldn't afford to come here. So what they did was they would work out an agreement with the English government and be assigned to a particular family living here in the colonies. And they would be servants to these families. And the average length, depending on a indentured servant's contract, was anywhere between minimum of 4 years usually. Some people worked less than that, usually a maximum of 10. Typically, they wouldn't work longer than that. Then there would be no real incentive to be a so-called indentured servant. But essentially, an indentured servant was asked to work. They would work for a family, typically those who either had a mid-sized farm or even a plantation. They would work 6, 7 days a week. They would work long hours. And many of the relationships between indentured servant and the so-called owner was one that wasn't necessarily that great. And I think that's important to understand, because even though it wasn't great, after their service was complete, English colonists were expected to give these indentured servants land. So that was the incentive for people to come here, have their passage paid for, and they would work. They would work long days, long weeks, long months, long years, so that eventually they could own land. And then once they owned land, they could work long enough to afford to have the rest of their family come over here. Now, indentured servitude pretty much dies out by the 1700s. It wasn't as popular. Thousands of people did come here as indentured servants. However, that wasn't necessarily as popular because of the people who were living here. It didn't make sense for a lot of the families that were paying to have these indentured servants come here and then turn around only a few years later to give them land. All right, because that's where the land was coming from. If you owned a large plot of land, if you owned 20 square acres, you may be giving your indentured servant 1 square acre of your property. And people figured, well, that's probably not necessarily the most effective way to save money and to have people work. So instead, people would turn to slaves, because you'd be paying a price for a slave, and that became your property for the slave's entire life. So indentured servitude will die out really by the 1700s. Underneath indentured servants, because eventually they too would own land, would be free African Americans. This is a reference to what we said up here. Only 1% of the middle class was considered to be of African descent, but nonetheless, many of these freed African Americans who had once been slaves never necessarily had the opportunity to own land. So therefore, they are taking on low paid jobs in cities and towns. They're working on merchant ships. They're working on in cities and towns with helping with shipbuilding, and especially in New England colonies, or even as servants or maids, so to speak, in the middle colonies or in the southern colonies, nannies as well. Anything that could afford them some sort of wage. Even though we see this word here, free, I think they were anything but free, because they lacked law, they lacked rights, political rights, and certainly socially there was a sense of prejudice and racism against African Americans here. So what we see in that racism and prejudice is rooted in what became common culture here in the colonies, and that was the acceptance of slaves. So tomorrow what we're going to do is get into that a little bit more specifically. We'll take a look at how slaves would have got here to the colonies, and we'll take a look at as to what slavery was really like in the colonies. So what I'm going to ask that you guys do now is, this is the end of section 2. So what I'm going to ask that you guys do with the rest of your class time here is to utilize your time to start your homework. Your homework is assignment 3.2b. It is those questions that would have popped up here at the beginning of class. I would ask that you quietly work on that. You will see that you do not necessarily need to submit it on eBackpack tonight. However, I will be checking it tomorrow. So I would ask that you, if you don't finish it here in class, that you work on that tonight. I will be back at 3 o'clock for anyone who has questions on anything we covered. I will be around for extra help if anyone is interested. I guess that will get started around 3:10, 3:15. And then obviously if you can't make it after school today, I will be around after school tomorrow. But I'm sure tomorrow, Halloween, many of you will be running out and running to your neighbor's house and ringing the doorbell and taking or receiving candy, I should say. And if quick fun fact, if nobody likes Twix or Kit Kats, I'd be more than happy to accept those as a token of your appreciation for these two lessons that I left you here on these videos here. But we'll get into what candy Mr. Kirk likes tomorrow a little bit more. All right, guys. Make sure on your way out you thank your substitute for being there for you guys. And again, look forward to getting back into class tomorrow. Take care.